Welcome to Postcards from Palisade, where we hear from the people who are shaping our slice of Western Colorado. I'm Lisa McNamara. Fred Judson and Andrea Judson are longtime Palisade residents, whom I got to know through the Monday night community bike rides. After the ride each week, people usually hang around to chat over food or drinks, which is where I learned about the incredibly interesting things that Andrea and Fred had done in their respective careers. Andrea worked in biocontrol at the Palisade Insectary, and Fred worked with disease-resistant bean strains at Colorado State University's Western Colorado Research Center at Fruita. I knew I had to get them on a podcast episode to share the cool things that they've done that have had a positive impact on the Grand Valley and beyond with a wider audience. So come geek out with us about bugs, beans, invasive species, and more on today's Postcard from Palisade.
Hi, my name's Andrea.
And my name is Fred, and we both worked in agricultural research and applied fields in this valley for over 30 years.
30 plus years. So is that going to be okay if we kind of overlap in our conversation?
Yeah.
Okay. Back when I first started, we kind of did some stuff out where he works, but then
That's how we met, actually, first time. My first week, she came out to release some Skimnus beetles?
Skimnus and Quattrodecim punctatus.
Mm-hmm.
P14s.
And I got detailed to help her build an exclusion cage out in the field, which keeps other insects from getting in, and it keeps the ones you release inside.
And you said she came out. Where did she come out to? Where were you working?
The 19 and 10 L Road for Colorado State University's Western Colorado Research Center at Fruita.
Okay. And what did you do there?
I started out as the Russian weed aphid entomologist, and from there, technician for the regional Russian weed aphid entomologist, and lasted about 5 years in that before we fixed the problem and the money ran out. And then they offered the dry bean seed program to me if I wanted to stay here, and I did not want to go back to the Front Range at that point in time.
Mm-hmm. Partly because you had met Andrea. And
it took her 10 years to ask me out after we met. So at that point in time, she wasn't in the picture when I moved over to run the bean program.
Okay. So Andrea, you grew up here, right?
I grew up in Palisade. My early years were spent on the Redlands of Grand Junction, and then my father decided that he wanted to do horses and mules, so we found property out here near Palisade, and I've lived here since 1976, so quite a while. But yeah, I'm a native of the Grand Valley.
Like, how did you get into your career? What made you want to get into that field?
Well, when I was the summer I was 16, a girlfriend called me and said, "Hey, do you need a job?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I could use a summer job." And she goes, "Well, it's at the Insectary in Palisade." And so I went and talked to him, and the next day I had a job. So I worked there from the age of 16 to the age of 50.
Wow. That's awesome.
I worked there 6 years as a seasonal employee, and then 30 years as a full-time employee. And I have equivalent to a biology degree, which I learned on the job. I was fortunate enough I didn't have to go to college. For me, myself, I learned more on the job than I think I ever would have learned from a book. So I was very grateful for that job, and I enjoyed it immensely.
What was your official title?
I was a biological pest specialist.
Okay. What kind of projects did you work on throughout your career?
I worked on several different projects. When I first started, I worked with ladybird beetles, different ladybugs. There was 3 different ladybugs. A Skimnus, which was a real small ladybug that could get in the whorls of the wheat and eat the aphids that would be down in there, the Russian wheat aphid. And I worked on the MAC program, which MAC was a Macrocentris.
Encephalivores.
There you go, Fred said it. Which was a beneficial insect to help control oriental fruit moth, which is a pest of peaches. And rearing that insect saved the growers hundreds, maybe even a few $1,000s a year in spray costs. So, and those insects, all the insects that were raised at the insectary were given back to the public for free because the insectary is a state-owned facility. So the taxpayers were paying for our jobs, basically. One of my favorite ones was working with purple loosestrife, which is a noxious weed from Europe that came over on ship ballast probably, or in different seeds, and it's very prominent on the East Coast, and it crowds out native grasses and cattails and clogs up the natural flow of little creeks and streams. And there was extensive studies abroad to bring in this insect called Hylobius, and it was a root-boring weevil, and it would lay an egg at the base of the soil and the plant, and then this little weevil would bore into the roots, and it took about 2 years for its life cycle to be completed in the roots. A professor from UC Davis in California came up with an artificial diet to feed to these Hylobius insects, and their life cycle, instead of 2 years, went to about 2 months on this artificial diet. So I had the opportunity to go to California and learn how to make this diet and release lots and lots of Hylobius, mostly in the Nucla natarita area, but also on the east slope of Denver there's purple loosestrife there as well. I worked with musk thistle, which is not a native thistle of Colorado, and we had a beneficial insect called Conicus that would lay its eggs on the flowers of the musk thistle, and then those larvae would feed on the seeds, the flower seeds. So then the plant wouldn't produce seeds, so that would cut back on the spread of the weed itself. And that was a really fun project. You got to go around with a plastic bag and bend the head of the thistles over and shake them, and all these little insects would fall off into a bag, and then we'd take them back to the lab.
Oh my gosh.
And separate all the trash, so to speak, and collect just the insects, and then have a pure insect to re-release in other areas of Colorado.
Now, I didn't realize that. So I know that a lot of what you worked on, what the insectary worked on, was developing beneficial insects, like you say, that are going to specifically do one thing to kill a plant. And then having to go pick them up and bring them somewhere else is just like even one more step. That's so amazing.
Yeah, not a lot of the insects that we released, we had made insectary sites in the field. So we would go to those sites and collect from there and redistribute them. And as the insect populations grew, we had more to collect, which we could re-release in other problem areas. But biological control takes a lot of patience and time. To get a good field establishment could take anywhere from 10 to 20 years.
Wow.
So as much as it is a benefit for us to be using that, a lot of people aren't patient enough to get to the results, and then they end up using herbicides and pesticides to control the weed, which puts all that product in our air and potentially can be a bad thing. But if you're patient, it's just amazing to see when it works. It's just absolutely mind-boggling that it works. But most of our weed pests came from Europe and Asia, and so that's where the native insects came from. And then the weeds came here. There was no natural predators for them, and then they just took over our native plants and weeds and other stuff. So
I think now would be a good time for me to break in and talk a little bit about a misconception. You said the insectary was developing insects.
Ooh.
They aren't. Nobody is creating new insects. What they're doing is taking insects that exist and increasing their numbers and then redistributing them.
Yep, that's a good point. They're not actually growing a bug from like you grew beans or like bean varieties,
No,
right?
we're not doing that.
no,
Yeah, good point.
we're just rearing them in large enough numbers that they could be released out in the field.
Sure. Is there some work that has to go into finding the right bug for the job?
Well, that work goes to the USDA, where they have a insectary facility in France, where those insects are brought to that facility, and they go through rigorous controls to see if they'll eat on roses, if they're going to eat your vegetable garden, if they're going to do other different things, even before they're brought to the United States.
Oh, interesting.
And then they're brought to the United States, and they go through the rigor here in the United States in Beltsville, Maryland, at a USD facility in Maryland, before they're even considered to be released in the United States. So it's a very rigorous thing that goes through to get insects okayed to come into our country.
And that makes sense, because the last thing we want to do is bring in something that's going to be a problem, right? You're trying to solve a problem, not make more problems.
Right. There were actually 2 insects that we raised on purple loosestrife, and not only did we use artificial diet, but in some cases we had to grow the weed in our greenhouses at the facility, and growing weeds in a greenhouse situation is very, very difficult. A potted weed just doesn't like to be in pots, basically. It takes a lot of TLC to grow weeds in a controlled environment. So there's a lot of strategies involved with both things. You rear the insect on weeds that you've cultivated in a greenhouse. Those weeds aren't necessarily as healthy as they might find out in the regular environment and where it's located, and you have to be on top of it with fertilizers. And we had weed problems in our soils that we used, and we made up our own soil mix at our facility, which we thought, well, it did help grow healthier plants, but not as healthy as that you would find out its natural setting.
They also had some insect problems in there.
Yeah, we had aphid problems, and
insectivores on the plants, the weeds they were trying to grow.
So,
of course.
Our greenhouses weren't insect proof. They would come in the cracks and crannies of the greenhouse, but we did our best.
Yeah, I mean, you're trying to control a lot of different things there. Why is what you did important? And again, I think it's important, but I'm curious how you describe it.
I think without some sort of biological control for our plant and weed pests or insect pests, we would just become overwhelmed with weed species that aren't good for anything. They're not good for grazing, they're not good for anything. They'd crowd out our native vegetation, and that would just be a detriment to everyone. As slow as biological control is to get established, I would sure hate to see the program disappear, because it's so beneficial. It just cuts out huge costs to growers, farmers that have these weed problems. They don't know how to get rid of it. Here we might have a solution for you. And they're excited about it too. They want to, see that what they're doing is a safe control, that it's not going to hurt their livestock or their kids running through the field, or even just the average person.
A successful biocontrol program reduces the amount of pesticides that are used, and everybody knows that's a good thing.
Yeah. I need something in my yard. Biological control of weeds. Of every weed there is.
Well, there is a control for bindweed.
Oh yeah? I have some of that.
You can get bindweed mites from the insectary.
Can just a regular person go get something from the insectary?
Yes.
No way.
It's open to the public. There's a limited supply.
Okay.
You usually get put on a list, and each season, as those weeds and insects are at their highest level of production, we have staff and summer employees that will go out and collect those, and we try to fulfill each request that is received. But sometimes there's so many requests that we don't get to everybody every year. But yeah, there are insects over there that you can actually get for your your garden.
And we could show you how to collect them on your own,
Yeah?
too.
Because they are established very well in certain places.
Okay.
But I think the most beneficial insect that is reared at the insectary is the mac wasp, or Oriental fruit moth. That the insectary started in 1945 here in Palisade, and they specifically only reared that specific insect. And to lose that culture with the insect, or to have the budget cut so it's not feasible to rear that insect, I think that would be a huge detriment to this area. Our area here in Palisade is unique in itself, and me personally, I'd like to keep it agriculture, and if that means to help out the grower or the farmer, then I'm all for that.
Mm-hmm. So we were talking about this a little bit before, but is it, being that the insectary is state funded, is it something where you're always worried about losing funding? And
Well, it was in the 80s and early 90s and part of the early 2000s, but we have our supervisor in Denver fights hard. I mean, he's the one that has to come up with a budget for everything. So he works hard working with the legislators and saying, no, this is a very important part of the Department of Agriculture, and we need X amount of monies to keep it going. And
Well, we do have some budget shortfalls coming up for the state, so yeah, it's a worry.
Mm-hmm.
It's always a worry.
Yeah, it's hugely important for this area.
It's a shame that there's not more public knowledge, that the public doesn't have the knowledge that these things exist.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a small part of the budget for the Department of Agriculture that it's easily overlooked. Say, well, this is so much small. This is a smaller piece of the pie. We can get rid of it, but it's such a helpful thing for the Department of Agriculture to have that facility here in Palisade. Mm-hmm. And it's been fought to be kept here in Palisade. Mm-hmm. There was talk many times to moving it to Denver. And our local fruit growers got together with legislators and said, no, we need it here. And this saves us so much money. It's a unique, specialized program that it would be just a shame to see it go away.
Yeah.
And another thing that's interesting to point out is once you have biological control established, it's essentially free because it regenerates itself, and it's also affordable. Mm-hmm. It's very cheap.
Yeah. It's cyclic as well. As the insects eat out their food, the population of the insects will go down as the weed problems go down, and then the weed problem comes back up, and so will the insects. So, it's unless there's some extreme thing that kills off the insects, it'll always be out there.
That's cool. That is definitely one of those things that I think people don't realize is happening, and you don't really miss or understand the impact of if it's taken away until it's gone. Was there anything that you were working on that it just didn't work out?
Well, they all kind of work out. They may not work out like you want it to work out. Even with the artificial diet, you had to be very, very careful of using clean, sterile equipment to mix up that diet, because if you get mold or mildew in those little cups that those larvae are feeding on, there's a dead bug. Mm-hmm. And the greenhouse situation was very difficult. It was very difficult. We used to rear a little parasitic wasp for alfalfa weevil, and our alfalfa in the greenhouse was constantly covered with aphids. It was constantly covered with aphids, and we do everything we could to knock the aphid situation down. I think that was my most problematic was the greenhouse situation. Although I loved working in the greenhouse, that was my favorite place to be. But it was a challenge. It was more like a game for me. I'm gonna beat this thing. I'm gonna make it work. I'm gonna make it work. And I tried a lot of different things to make it work, and sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. But as an overall 30-year career, I was very blessed to have that job. And I would push biological control to anybody and everybody. Mm-hmm. And if If you didn't know there's an insectary in Palisade, there is. And I think anybody that hears this should look up the Palisade Insectary in Palisade, Colorado, and give them a call for a tour. Go for a tour. You'll learn some stuff. You'll come away there with some knowledge that you didn't know what was out there. And I think you would respect what they do there a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. What's your least favorite weed or insect? What do you see that just makes you feel
We
angry?
did work with leafy spurge, which is a noxious weed, and it's toxic to cattle. It's not a fun weed to work with because it's kind of like a poinsettia. It has a lactic acid that comes out. It's real sticky and gooey, but there was a insect that we tried. It was called a Hyles moth. It was kind of like a hornworm. It looked like a tomato worm with a little horn, and it had different colors on it. And I could deal with the larvae when they were little, but when they got as big as my thumb, or my finger, I just couldn't deal with those. I had to have someone else come and deal with that stage of the insect, but that's the one I least liked working with.
Just gross.
Just grossed me out.
That's fair. That's fair.
I think just on the college level, I know that in a lot of universities, agricultural universities, entomology isn't a thing they teach. I couldn't certainly do what I did without the people I worked with that had a background in entomology or pest management or pathogens and weeds and stuff. We've got to keep things like that going. As soon as that disappears, that knowledge disappears. I mean, you lose a lot of knowledge when somebody retires from their job that they've worked there for many years. And it can't be helped, but it certainly can be improved on if those educational classes are still available.
Right, you need someone there to pick up the baton. Like, we can't watch a YouTube about weed management or increasing bean yield. It's like you can watch a YouTube to do a lot of things, but that's not going to solve everything in the future.
Well, I think an important thing that's happening in the United States, certainly on the university level and at research level, is there aren't very many young Americans who are getting into that field. And we are filling those positions with people that we're training that come from other countries. And that's not a bad thing. But I really wish that more young Americans would become interested in and involved in all facets of agriculture. And I'd also like to tell an old entomology joke while I'm here.
Okay.
When you ask somebody who's going to college if they know what an entomologist is, a lot of them will reply that, yeah, it works with insects or bugs or something like that. And I say, no, it's a biologist with a biology job. Because if you have a degree in entomology, you're going to be able to get a job. And that's not necessarily true if you go into forestry or some of the other biological fields. If you get an entomology degree, you're guaranteed you're going to be able to go get a good job.
Because it applies to so many different fields, or?
Yeah. Well, you can't have food without, insect control of some kind, whether it's biological or using, some of the integrated pest management techniques that we use now. And, you need people who understand how to do that and are developing new techniques for managing insect pests, as well as just the ecological side of entomology too. And that's probably even more underfunded than the agricultural side is. We all know that we have problems with pollinators. And the declining numbers and species of insects that we have worldwide is becoming a huge problem. Habitat loss and pesticide use has really decimated the numbers and types of insects that we have. People all know about the non-native European honeybee, which wasn't in North America up until the 1700s. But we have lots and lots of other pollinators, bees and wasps and accidental pollinators like
Ants.
miller moths and
Ants even.
yeah, anything that essentially touches a plant can pollinate it.
Birds.
Birds, there's some mammals. There was a recent study released that showed that wolves in the Middle East are actually pollinating a rare type of plant because they like to rub their muzzles on it. And when they're doing that, they're picking up pollen. And when they do it again, they're transferring that pollen to another plant. So Yeah, the entomology world is big, and boy, there's some pretty serious issues that are happening in the world right now with entomology, and lack of insects that are dying out on us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be great if people weren't so insect phobic. Insects are cool. A majority of them will not hurt you.
Right. That's the tough thing, to kind of stay positive in the face of that thought, but it's just awesome that you both really work towards trying to solve that big problem. And I don't think it gets a lot of attention either. It's like another one of those things that you don't notice until it's not there anymore.
Yeah. Well, the insectary, like I said, has been here since 1945. The population of Grand Junction, maybe 5%, knows that. That's horrible. We need more public education, people that go out there and promote, not just with our legislators, but to the general public.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, that does happen to a certain degree with the staff at the insectary, but I think that could be somebody's full-time job over there.
Yeah.
There's not the funding for that type of person. So again,
If the general public knew about all the good work that's being done over there, they would knock down the doors of any legislature who tried to cut the funding out from under them.
Mm-hmm.
So a little more visibility would be great. We need to get the word out that this is here in Palisade and it's doing really, really good, important work, and it needs to continue.
How much of your time do you spend like talking about bugs?
a lot. I mean, we travel the world, and we can't get away from our jobs. We're retired, but it's just like, you go someplace new and you see a weed or something, and it's like, oh my God, look, they have that here. I wonder if they're doing anything about that. And a good example for me was we traveled to New Zealand, and lo and behold, we go in this botanical garden in Christchurch, and they're propagating purple loosestrife.
Oh, wow.
And I was just like, oh my God, they're growing it here. And intentionally, yeah. And I found the curator, and they said that was no problem.
Really?
And I'm like, you got to be kidding. It is a huge problem.
Wow.
And later that day, we took a little paddle boat down the Avon River, which went right by the backside of the botanical gardens, and there was loosestrife growing in that waterway.
No way.
And it went clear to the ocean.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That must have made you see red.
We often will be driving somewhere and we're like, oh my God, Dalmatian toadflax. And then we'll stop and pull it all up.
Yeah, if it's a small patch, we'll pull it. Even a lot of people think that butter and eggs, it's called. It looks like a snapdragon. It's yellow.
Oh yeah, is it yellow with the orange center?
Mm-hmm, yeah, and it's called
Yellow toadflax.
Yellow
Oh, yeah.
toadflax, or butter and
That's
eggs is the
bad?
more common name for it.
I didn't know that was bad.
Yeah, it crowds out native vegetation.
This valley has a huge problem with Russian knapweed, and it's getting a lot worse. People don't recognize it, and I can see from your face that you don't recognize it.
What does it look like?
It's
Upright
probably in
woody
here.
forb with a very deep perennial taproot, purple flowers that people think are pretty, and it grows in monocultures. It actually performs chemical warfare on its neighbors, which is called allelopathy, where the roots exude a chemical which prevents other seeds from germinating and other plants from encroaching on it.
Okay.
So it produces these
I
dense
didn't find that, but
monocultures.
I worked on that towards the end of my career, and that was not a fun one to work with.
Yeah, I don't think I have any of that in my yard. So you got
Typically
that
won't
going for
find
me.
it in the yard, but
Okay.
roadsides, railroad right-of-ways. There never used to be any between Palisade and Clifton on Highway 6, and now there's some pretty big patches of it. And next year they're going to be bigger.
Right.
Yeah.
Because
Everybody
nobody
will
knows
know
what it is.
Yeah.
Which you would think that CDOT should have a noxious weed person in their office, or several.
Right.
Well, they used to, but budget cuts, they
Yeah.
take people like that out of the equation fairly quickly. Well, I haven't seen the numbers recently, but somewhere around 90% of all of our pesticide use in the United States is used against invasive species that don't
Whether
belong
that's,
here in North America.
plant or insect.
Yeah, plants and insects.
That's amazing.
If we'd had a better quarantine system, we'd be far better off right now.
What was your official title?
I was technically a research associate, and I went through 1, 2, and 3 as I progressed up the ladder.
What would you call yourself if you were introducing yourself to somebody at a party?
I would say I was a bean geek. Basically,
Okay.
running the bean seed program, we worked with the breeding program, and the seeds came to me, and I increased those seeds in the field until we had enough to go to trials with them. So, no, I was an agronomist, essentially. Started out in entomology and then moved over into a specialized field of agronomy,
Okay.
plant breeding, if you will.
Which is odd because I worked with insects and Fred was an entomologist and didn't work with insects.
Yeah, that's
So-
interesting. So you both are entomologists at heart, but maybe not even at heart. You're a bean geek at heart.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people who aren't from Colorado or haven't been here are surprised that peaches and grapes and things grow here in western Colorado. I don't know if anybody ever thinks about beans. So why are beans important here for
Well,
this area?
I think the single most important thing is that dry beans, pinto beans, a few black beans, yellow beans that we're growing here now, they're all very susceptible to bacterial and fungal diseases. And the factors that increase the problems with those are humidity. And we have very low humidity here. So Mesa County, Delta County, and Montrose County are the only 3 counties that can reliably certify disease-free seed. If you start with disease-free seed and you plant the seed in an area that has disease problems like eastern Colorado, then you're going to get probably an additional 30 days of growing season before those diseases manifest themselves in the plants. And this is our earlier genetics. Later genetics, we had bred a lot of disease resistance into these plants so that we didn't really need fungicides as much. But you could delay it essentially by 30 days, the onset of having disease issues, by starting with disease-free seed. And that's why the seed program was here in western Colorado.
Are beans actually grown commercially around here?
It used to be a much bigger crop particularly in Delta and Montrose counties. The price received for producing edible beans is very low compared to some other crops. And it's seen more as a rotational crop so that you can break disease and insect cycles by rotating in. It's not really a money maker.
Okay.
The guys who are making a little bit more money are the guys that are producing seed. But we're competing with areas like a small area in Wyoming and Idaho. The state of Idaho is huge in seed production, disease-free seed production, and we haven't been competing well with them. Part of it's a scale of economy thing. We're just too small.
Is the program still going on today?
It is sort of going on. When I retired, the bean breeder in Fort Collins who ran the dry bean seed breeding program, he also retired. And CSU decided, since it's really a minor crop, that they wouldn't replace him. And also, initially in bean breeding, it was all done by USDA and universities. And in the last 20 years, private industry has gotten more involved in it. And perhaps that's where plant breeding belongs, is in private industry. I mean, we built a lot of really good things in the government sector that helped it along, but there are mostly private breeders going on, private breeding companies going on right now, carrying on the lines of dry bean seed.
Andrea, we started to talk about earlier was the funding. So who funds it? Who spends the money on it, right?
The dry bean seed program was self-funded because the breeding program made the crosses and then sent the seed to me. Those seeds were increased in the field so that we had a large enough volume of seed that it could actually be sent out across the United States for head-to-head trials with other varieties so that we would get information. Obviously, the most important one is yield. I mean, you have to have yield enough to be able to sell it and make some money at it. But also we needed disease resistance and plant architecture that's upright and makes it easier to harvest and things like that.
It must take a really long time because every year you're limited to like natural growing conditions. So every year you have a new crop.
We are, and initially when I started 35 years ago, it would take about 10 years to bring a cross into a publicly released variety.
Wow.
You start in the greenhouse, you make a cross, and you get 26 seeds or 30, a very small number of seeds. And then those seeds would come to the field. In my case, it would come to western Colorado, and I would plant them as individual plant rows and keep track of them as they grow, because a new cross is still segregating. It's essentially a hybrid, and it's going to take, in case of beans, about 4 years for the outcrossing to disappear. But you have to recognize when those plants are segregating and then keep them separate so that the seed is pure seed.
So you have to be very patient.
And we also, in the early days, we didn't have the ability to see, essentially to look at the DNA of a plant. But in later years, that ability was much greater. So, you could actually see what the genomes are in a plant and, breed accordingly for that. And also later in our career, we'd established ourselves in the United States as one of the premier programs, so we were selling our seed and making a little bit more money, and we could afford winter nurseries then, because you only get one generation a year in the northern hemisphere. So initially we sent seeds to Brazil, but it came back full of diseases, and that set us back farther than it advanced us. And about the last 8 years of my career, we were sending seed to the North end of the South Island of New Zealand, where they had very similar growing conditions, and we found a guy who was really good at seed production who could do it for us. So we'd get 2 generations. So that cut essentially 10 years into 5, so that we could increase the amount of seed that we had available.
Wow. Why is what you did important? I think it's important, but
Well,
why would you say it's important?
When people started trying to improve, and that's what we do with crop seeds. When we breed them, we're trying to improve things, primarily yield, disease resistance, seed quality, things like that. We did it because we were getting really low yields. In the 40s and 50s, the yield per acre of dry beans was around 600 pounds per acre. Even in the 70s and 80s, we were only up to 1,100 to 1,200 pounds per acre. And through selective breeding, where we bred for yield, we bred for disease resistance and plant architecture, the plant shape that made the plant able to yield more. We increased those yields from, initially 500 to 600 pounds in the 50s and 60s, all the way up to 4,000 pounds in the modern era. And I think it's also important to say that the breeding techniques being used are pollen transfers. They're the old-fashioned, you cross plant A with plant B and you hope to get a good result. There are no GMO dry beans in the United States.
Yeah, that's an important point.
The only one that I'm aware of was a plant that was bred in Brazil, and they actually asked permission to use some of Colorado State University's genetics for this cross to defeat a virus problem that they have in the southern hemisphere. So the reason we're doing it is, number one, a farmer has to make a profit. It's a business just like any other business. If they can't make a profit, they can't stay in business. So in order to do that, you need to have a plant that has high yield and lower inputs. In this case, fungicides primarily. Disease resistance that we bred into the root system and to the leaves, typically in somewhere eastern Colorado, western Nebraska, where they have higher humidity, they would have to make 2 to 3 applications of a fungicide every year in order to get a full crop. And with that disease resistance that we and other institutions bred in, we took that down to 0 in many cases. So we increased the yields 4-fold, and we decreased the amount of inputs, especially pesticide or fungicide specifically. So I think that's a pretty good thing.
It's pretty cool.
People don't realize it in the United States because we have a lot of food choices. But in third world countries, dry beans and rice are what feed the majority of people.
Right.
So not only did we benefit from it, but those other people get to use our genetics. University programs don't really prevent other people from using the genetics like some of the private companies do. We did patent our seeds so that growers would have to pay us a very small royalty in order to use our seeds, but nothing compared to private industry.
Interesting. Seems fair.
Well, we patented them because we had to fund our program.
Right.
The taxpayers can't foot the bill for everything.
Yeah.
If you're able to generate some income by selling the seed that you have bred and then later released to the public, then you can pay for the program.
Yep, makes sense. Fred, was there ever anything that you, like any challenge or any project you had that you just weren't able for some reason to solve? Like, what made you just bang your head against the wall?
Well, dry beans are traditionally harvested by cutting the roots and piling them in a windrow and letting them dry, and then combining them. And this is because the pod load is carried very low on the plant.
Okay.
So it's not like a soybean plant where you can run a sickle bar or a combine head under them and pick up the whole plant.
Mm-hmm.
So it's cut and then windrowed into like hay,
Mm-hmm.
and then you come by and pick it up with the combine after that. But when it's cut and laying in that windrow, it's very susceptible to wind. It can blow it away, or rain can get on it and cause mildew. It discolors the seeds, all sorts of things. And all the programs in the United States are still working, that are left, are still working to essentially breed a direct combinable dry bean, one that carries its pod load high enough off the ground that a sickle can get under it and harvest the whole plants all at once. That will take away problems that you have with losing yield because of wind, and also damage by water, thunderstorms, etc. And it's not been real successful yet. I mean, it's a slow change. It's very common for direct combining to occur in places like North Dakota, which have more wind and rain problems than we have. And they are losing a lot of yield because they're harvesting our old-fashioned dry beans that have the pod load very close to the ground, and they're accepting a 25% loss in order to avoid having their beans blow away or get ruined by a thunderstorm. So eventually somebody's going to get the right genetic combination. We'll have a very strong stem that carries the seed pods very high off the ground. It'll happen someday. But that was one thing that we tried for a long time, and just it was frustrating.
Yeah, that's so interesting though. It's like the relay race of you did such a big piece of it and then you pass it on.
Well, anything that has to do with agriculture is a long, drawn-out process, and there's a lot of patience and hard work that goes into that. I personally don't grow a garden. We do grow a garden, but
Fred grows a garden.
Fred grows a garden. I would just as soon help our local growers. They work hard at it. I'll pay them to grow my food.
I completely agree with you right away.
It's just a slow process, and you just have to have patience. Patience is huge.
Yeah, I'd rather pay the farmer to grow my food personally because
I spent 40 years in agriculture, and I still really enjoy growing my garden, my small garden in the backyard.
Yeah.
I mean, the food does taste great when it comes out, but
Fred has always wanted to plant fruit trees in our yard, and I'm like, no, we're going to support our local grower.
Agricultural research at a university level is suffering from really bad funding. And I think that's definitely the biggest problem that we had. And we were using 40 and 50-year-old equipment, and we spent as much time mechanicking and fabricating equipment to keep it in the field to perform the research and the dry bean harvesting that was going on at the Western Colorado Research Center. To me, it's mind-boggling that we will not fund agricultural research in the United States to the level that could really make it so much more powerful. I mean, we could do great things if we weren't fighting poor equipment all the time.
yeah, that's a good point. We have to spend a lot of time repairing things, so you really had to be multifaceted there to know.
Well, I came out of college with an entomology degree, and I didn't really have very good mechanical abilities, but I learned. I became a fabricator, a welder, troubleshooter, problem solver. It's good to have that ability, but if we'd had better equipment to start with, we could have put much more effort into the actual nuts and bolts of what research is in the field.
So looking to now or to the future, it's probably just already answered that, but what do you think is the biggest challenge that our current kind of generation of researchers and scientists are dealing with in the Grand Valley? What do you see as being some of the big issues in the future that they're going to have to figure out how to handle?
Funding.
That's what I was like, I feel like you probably just answered that.
And also, I'm going to come at it from a row crop agriculture position, because that's what I did. and that's somewhat different than the fruit a little bit. But the two biggest problems I see are water availability in the future. I mean, there's a water shortage, and everybody wants our
That's
water.
true for the fruit industry,
Well,
too.
it is,
Yeah.
and
For anything.
and they're going to either buy our water from us, and it's already happening in the Grand Valley. Large, wealthy corporations or whatever you want to call them are already buying water shares from this valley. And another problem that people probably don't see is we have a big salinity problem. Our soils are becoming, if you irrigate soils, they will leave behind what's in the water. We have a lot of salt in our water. It comes from the Manco Shale formations in the valley.
Interesting.
And high saline soils will reduce our yields. And they are becoming slightly more saline. So we need to work on methods that will not only leave less salts in our soils, but also breed plants that are salt tolerant. And it's not just a local Grand Valley problem. This is a worldwide problem.
So you agree on water?
Oh,
and
yes,
funding?
most definitely.
Well, in an area like ours that gets 10 inches of precip a year,
Right.
you're not going to grow anything without supplemental water. And it's got to come from somewhere. And all those people downstream from us, they want it as badly as we do, and they're wealthier in a lot of cases. We didn't even talk about the tamarisk,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
which has been a success story.
Yeah, that's a huge success
Yeah.
story. I didn't work on the project myself, but I knew enough about the project. Tamarisk was brought over from Eurasia as a
Soil stabilizer.
soil stabilizer wind block, and it got out of control. So there's an insect here that we reared at the insectary, 2 different species, and it's a leaf defoliator. So the larvae feed on the leaves. They get to full term as a larvae, they drop down into the ground and pupate, and then the adult emerges, and the process starts over and over, and it cycles like that. It's been a huge success story on the Colorado River, as you may have noticed driving from here to Fruita, even Moab. There's been a lot of mechanical use on it in the Moab area where they go down and they cut it off and then put it through a chipper or whatever,
Dig up the roots.
dig up the roots. But the tamarisk beetle is a huge.
Yeah, you'll be driving along the Colorado River and see what appears to be dead or dying brown plants. That's from the tamarisk beetle.
Okay.
It's not from herbicides or chemicals.
Okay. Not from a
That's-
drought or anything like that.
Yeah, those insects, they pick out I don't know how they sense which tree to go to, because one tree will be covered with insects and the other tree's doesn't have anything on it. There's some sort of pheromone, natural pheromone that the tamarisk tree puts out that attracts the insects, but the insects will keep attacking it year after year until it finally kills it.
Wow.
And then if it does come back at the roots, it will get that new growth from coming up and spreading it again. But the tamarisk is one of the biggest salt emitters in the Colorado River basin.
Right. So do you see many healthy growing tamarisk around anymore?
Oh yeah, lots.
Yeah.
Lots.
But not like it was.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll even see it we go to the San Rafael swell a lot to ATV, and even in the canyons there where you wouldn't even think it would be,
How did it get
there it is, but it probably got spread by a bird,
Yeah.
picked up a seed and got dropped off by an animal or a bird or something. But it's amazing how quickly it will take over a natural willow, where willows can be just as thick and dense to get through as a tamarisk culture, but the willow is native.
Right.
And that was one problem that a lot of people were against releasing the tamarisk beetle, because there was an endangered bird that nested in the tamarisk,
Willow flycatcher.
the western willow flycatcher. But what they didn't realize is that as soon as the tamarisk is gone, the willows will come back, and there will still be the place for the bird to nest. Well, I don't know if I should go into that.
There is a real missing component of biological control, and it comes back to the nature of abhors a vacuum. Is if you bring in an insect and it wipes out whatever weed was there, you're going to have bare ground. something is going to come back in. And if man doesn't do it, and we aren't currently doing that very well, it's going to be another invasive weed. You can see it in Tibet Canyon where we had the big fire that killed all the cottonwoods and a lot of the tamarisk. We've got a huge Russian knapweed problem coming in there now.
We've taken over by cheatgrass.
If there had been a mechanism for having people to come in and reseed it and revegetate it, we would have maybe been able to prevent that from happening. But it's a missing component.
Sure. Yeah, because what's going to take over after something has been burnt, especially, is whatever grows the quickest. And
Yeah. That's going to be an invasive,
probably, more than likely.
Before we end, I'm curious from each of you, what's your favorite thing about Palisade? That's something I like to ask people. Like, what keeps you here?
That it's small, and there's no traffic lights. And other than the big gas station out by the interstate, it's pretty much light pollution free. But
Great stars.
it was a great place to grow up. And the fruit here is very beneficial too. So
Yeah, I love our small town culture and the people that we have in Palisade. We've got some really great people here.
it's a friendly place for the most part. Whereas you go into Grand Junction, people just put up their little blinders and keep on doing what they're doing. But here you can pretty much stop on the street and talk to anybody, which I like that about a small town. I wish my nieces and nephews would have grown up in a small town.
If you're an outdoor recreation-minded person, there's so many things. You might not be right next door in Palisade, but we can go into the Utah Canyon country. We can go look for petroglyphs. We can cross-country ski on Grand Mesa or ski at Powderhorn or raft the river. There's not very many places that will have all those things right together.
Well, thank you both so much for your time. This is really great. I really appreciate it. As I was editing this episode, I realized that Fred, Andrea, and I had spent a lot of time talking about invasive species, but we didn't get into what the average person could do to stop their spread. So I reached out to them afterwards to get their thoughts. This is what Fred said. Regarding invasive species, it's most important to be knowledgeable and aware. For most people, this means just to be aware that invasives are a problem for any ecology. Just the idea that it's a problem without knowing specifics is good enough. Buy plants from a reputable local nursery. Choosing native plants is a way to avoid invasives, and is better for our environment since they are adapted to our climate, possibly drought tolerant, and may benefit other natives like native pollinators. And to paraphrase something we also talked about, don't collect seeds you find somewhere and plant them at home, because you could easily be planting an invasive species. Fred continued, if in doubt, get expert advice. Colorado State University's Tri-River Extension Office in Mesa County will have the best up-to-date, science-based information on plants and insects. You can call or visit them at the county fairgrounds, and they'll direct you to an expert. You can reach them at 970-244-1834 or tra.extension.colostate.edu. Thanks to Fred for the great tips, and to Andrea and Fred for the hard work that they continue putting into improving the valley they love. Are you currently doing work in these or other biological fields in the Grand Valley? If so, I'd love to hear from you. I'm also still looking for more Grand Valley myths and legends, either your take on what we covered last episode, or others that we didn't get into. You can email me at lisa@postcardsfrompalisade.com. The podcast theme music is Riverbend by Jeff Roper. Thanks for listening. With love from Palisade.